Hello! Today I have a little bit of mending to do, and I thought I would just share that with you because I'm a big advocate of mending your handmade things and your shop bought things and just trying to get as much usage out of textiles as we can. So this jumper is one I knitted for my husband quite a few years ago. It is Sarcactus. So we've got some colour work on the yoke and around the bottom and on the lower part of the arms. And this was the first iteration of the pattern. We later made some modifications to the sleeves because they ended up being too tight. And I've mended them before and apparently left a tail. Because they just wear through at the elbows. This is a woolen spun yarn and it's knitted at a slightly loose gauge, which means it is a bit less strong. Like a looser tension or gauge will provide less strength to your fabric. And so if you've got a tight sleeve, kind of like this one, when you bend your elbow, especially if you lean on your elbow a lot, there's going to be a lot of strain on those few stitches there. And if you've got a looser sleeve, that's less likely to happen because the sleeve has more space to move around your arm. The friction is less likely to happen in the same place, and there's not going to be there's more room for the sleeve to move around, and so it's not going to be pulled as taut across your elbow. So I have mended this one here, and I think he must have just pulled his sleeves up or something because it's laddered lower down. This should be a fairly quick fix. So I've used Swiss darning, which is basically duplicate stitch. If you've ever maybe considered intarsia and decided it's too much faff, like if you've got a single motif in like the middle of a jumper or something, or just one little motif, stranded colour work is a real pain. Intarsia can be annoying if you've just got a few stitches, and carrying around that extra ball of yarn can be annoying. And so duplicate stitch is a good way to add on to it. And it is also really good for mending because it follows the path of the previous stitches. This is also called Swiss darning. I'm using, so this is Mending DK yarn, which is my own line of yarn. I'm using some more Mending DK, but I think this one is actually from a different batch, so it's likely to turn out slightly darker. You can see here, this little patch. It's very subtle, but it is a very slightly different shade. So first up, because we've got some laddering here, and this yarn isn't actually broken down here, I'm just going to use a crochet hook to get those stitches back where they should be. And this is the same process for if you have ever made a mistake in your knitting and instead of ripping back all of your knitting, you decide to just drop down the stitches where the mistake is, and then you can, if it's just stockinette, it's so easy to pick up just with a crochet hook. If you've got a stitch pattern, it can be a bit more fiddly because you have to make sure that you get your knits and purls right. If it's cables, it can be a lot more fiddly, especially if they're ones that travel. And I can see here that these stitches up here, the yarn is a little bit weaker. And so I'm going to extend my darning sort of a bit beyond the area where the stitches are actually broken. And that will mean that it should reinforce the surrounding stitches as well. So what I'm going to do is start a few rows across. And I tend to just leave a tiny bit of the end sticking out. And then I will go and sort of hopefully remember to trim that later. And that just kind of anchors it. And the one thing about duplicate stitch is it does add bulk, because if you're doing it on top of existing stitches, as I am here, obviously that area is going to be thicker. But for this case, on the elbows, that's sort of necessary just to provide that extra strength. So what I'm doing is going across one row of stitches, and I'm following the path of the yarn. And so that means you go into the stitch above, across it, and then pull it to approximately the right tension, and then down through the stitch below. And that then follows the path of sort of how you would create a single row of knit stitches. And I've made my yarn a little bit long here. See here, I'm following this stitch down, and then my needle is going through the stitch below, and then I'll follow it up and then through the stitch above. And so I'm working right to left to start with because I am right-handed and that's easier for me. But then for the next row we'll turn back and work left to right. You will find that your stitches look a little bit messy. Like you want to try and get as even tension as you can, but also you don't want to pull them too tight because that will create extra strain on the surrounding area, and you don't want them too loose because then they'll just look blobby and uneven and lumpy. But slight differences in tension will be helped by either a full block, so soaking the whole jumper and laying it out to dry, or for just a darn, if the jumper is otherwise clean, I tend to just use a bit of steam from the iron. Okay, so I think I've gone far enough this way. Like these stitches here are pretty stable, the weakness is around here. So I'm going to now go through this stitch, but then not go back down into the one below. And instead, I'm going to start working with my left hand because it's a bit easier. And I'm going to go left to right through the stitch above. And then carry on. And that will mean now for the stitches below, I'm also going through the stitches that I've just stitched over. And you want to be careful just on that turn, because where you're going through sort of half a stitch and then turning round, it can distort it a little bit. And obviously I'm just holding this here. I've got both layers of the sleeve, so we're just going to try to make sure we don't stitch through the underside of the sleeve. Now I'll just keep going a little bit until I get to the point where I'm at the area where there are actually stitches missing and where we've got yarn that's broken. Okay, we've reached the point now where I need to do a little bit of faffing, because I'm just about to get to the point where that stitch that we picked up with the crochet hook, we're going to be going around that one, but because there's nothing to anchor this stitch in place, it's going to be a little bit difficult to make another stitch. So we're just going to neaten things up a bit. That is the loose end of the yarn that broke, and then the other is just down here, and so it looks like it's only one row that has broken, which is convenient. So we've got some loose stitches up here, so I'll just get those quickly with the crochet hook. This yarn is quite fragile here, so I'm just trying to be quite careful. Now some people like to just chop out the tatty little bits of yarn, but I find they make my life easier. So I tend to leave them in place, and then just any stray ends, once I'm done, I'll just trim off. If I remember, because, you know. Right, so now to keep these in place, because they are wanting to escape, we need to add just some anchors. So this column here is fine. All of those stitches are intact, even if they're beginning to fray a little bit. So we've got 1, 2, 3 columns that are wandering about a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I've just got some sewing thread on a needle here in a contrasting colour. Contrasting colour is not important, I'm going to be removing this afterwards, and so it is just to help me keep track of it so I can take it out nice and easily. And so I've anchored it at the bottom of this column here. I'm going to be putting it up to about there. So I'm putting the thread in the middle of that column and across to the next one, and then I'll go down to the middle of the same column that I just came up through and across to the next column, and try and get them all lying nice and parallel, and then up again, same column, and just across to the next one, and then I will anchor it off just to make life a bit easier. So what these bits of thread do is they just give us a little bit of a framework for where we're placing the new stitches to replace ones that have disappeared. So this next column goes around this thread. So each thread represents a broken column of stitches, and then we'll go around. So we're trying to work so that that column will remain in the center of our new stitches. And that means where the previous yarn is missing, we still have something to hang our new stitches around, rather than trying to create stitches out of thin air. Because when we're knitting, the knitting needles would be supporting the new stitches that we're creating. I'm just making sure I've got a loop there that I can pass the next row of stitches through. You don't want to be pulling them too tight so that you can't get your needle cleanly into the next row. And then turning back round again. Okay, and now we're back at the column with the broken stitches. So we go into the right side of that thread and then wrap our yarn around the thread to create the new stitch. And then into that loop that we left, and then create a new loop around that yellow thread. And then last one on the threads. And then we can just carry on doing normal duplicate stitch. Now we're back at our area with really weak threads. Oops, gone through the wrong stitch again. This is where it gets potentially confusing because you've got doubled up stitches, but also where you've created new ones. And now because we know that only one row of stitches was actually missing, we can get back into, yeah, so this is the first row of stitches that was completely missing because the previous ones were just reinforcing the very straggly bits of yarn. So it is important to keep track of how many rows you've done and how many you still need to do. And then this one, so now turning into the next row, this is the row where we will be anchoring the new stitches that we've created into the existing rows above the hole. So we pick up that new stitch that we created there, and then we go through that stitch above and catch the loop of yarn that was created from like the bottom of the stitch that was dropped. And we just need to pull some stitches through because those ones got pulled loose when I was sorting out the ones in the column next to them. So this is all still a bit fragile at this point. But we are getting to the point where we have a sort of proper knit fabric. If I don't go down through the wrong gap again. And so now basically we are just duplicate stitching over some very fragile yarn. now that the hole's mended, it's all much easier. And I'm about to run out of yarn, so I'm going to get to the end of this little row and then change yarn on the end of the row. And that means that I don't want to change in the middle of where the hole is, because that's the area where there's quite a bit of strain on the fabric. I'm just going to put my needle in there, pull that yarn unsuccessfully through. There we go. And you can see that's beginning to look quite a bit neater. I don't really need these yellow threads anymore, but I'm going to keep them there just as a kind of reminder that that's a bit where I'm likely to get slightly confused. And then, rather than starting the new end where I just left off, I'm going to start it over at this side again, mostly because I just prefer working left to right. So here we go. It's not a completely invisible repair. You can tell where it is. The fabric is thicker, the yarn isn't exactly the same colour, but as that wears in, it'll kind of feel more like part of the jumper, and it means that it's once again wearable, and hopefully that'll last at least this winter before I have to mend it again, because as I said, the sleeves are just too tight. I'm not going to rip them back and reknit them. Eventually it might be that this has to become a shorter sleeve jumper that I might wear. But for now we can keep it limping along. And yeah. So it's always worth doing. This is why a stitch in time saves 9. Having to add in the extra threads and everything just kind of make it all take a little bit longer. So I am going to be just reinforcing a couple of rows on the other elbow above where I darned before, because that's beginning to get weak there as well. And it'll be so much quicker to just quickly reinforce that than let it wear through and then have to take ages. So yeah, I hope this has inspired you to maybe tackle some mending that needs doing. I know that I tend to put it off for quite a lot longer than I ought to, but it's nice every so often to get down for a good mending session, and you always feel better about things afterwards. So I hope this has inspired you, and I'll catch you next time. Bye bye.